And so now we're going to transition to a moderated discussion with our speakers. Please continue to, as questions arise, to put those in the Q&A, and we'll try our best to keep track of them and answer them either as part of our moderated discussion or in our session after this one. So why don't we just get started with maybe a question that arises from all of the presentations. I think all of the presentations highlighted that there are points at which women are leaving science, and some of the actions imply maybe what we think the underlying causes are: family decisions, mentorship. But I was wondering if the panelists can say specifically in the research that you've done, what are the reasons for women disproportionately leaving science at particular points in their careers? And I can we'll open it up to whomever. Maybe, I don't know if Alex, if you have data to inform this, but please, I'd love to open it up to everyone.
Yeah, so thank you, Tracy. I think it's a really, really interesting and complicated question. There's no one easy answer that I've seen anywhere. The research that I discussed actually doesn't have the capability to draw insights into that. We can measure the extent of it and the propensity for it over the lifetime, but we can't actually dig in and say concretely why it's happening. There have been many, many interesting studies that at much smaller scale that have tried to address that question. And there are many different hypotheses floating around. I would say that of the work I've seen, everybody thinks that whatever they set out to explore is the real reason why, and no one's ever disentangled whether there's one strong factor that dominates over anything else. I think it's a combination of many, many, many different things throughout the course of a lifetime. But maybe the other panelists who actually worked with the policy to try to fix this problem have a little bit more insight into how we can effectively correct the dropout.
Well, I mean, I have much smaller cohorts than you were presenting, Alex, but I mean, I have talked to postdocs at EMBL and also at other institutes sometimes after talks. But for the cohorts specifically, for example, in the LEAP fellows and for other cohorts. So these are relatively small numbers, but groups of maybe 20, 25. And I've done that with a few groups. And one of the common themes, well, there's a couple of key themes that come out. I mean, one is, I hear a lot as, I don't think I would be able, I don't think, I'm good enough. So that's sort of a confidence thing. But another one is that, which I found very interesting and actually a bit surprising, is what I've heard from some women postdocs is that they felt they needed to change their personality. They needed to behave in a way that wasn't them. They needed to behave in a very aggressive way and be very outgoing and aggressive. And in one sense, that also speaks badly, let's say, of us, of the PI population, including myself here then. Is this the impression that we're giving our postdocs is one thing, but also just to let, and if there's any postdocs out there listening, I think the brilliant thing actually about academia and about running a research group, being a professor, a group leader, is that there's so many different ways that you can do this. There's so many different types of leaders. And that's a really important thing. And actually you set the tone and you set the characteristic of your own lab. And so you can have your lab with its personality. There's an excellent book on that lead or it's at the helm as it's called. And that's one of the principles in that book for any person. But I think that's the thing that I've heard quite a lot, actually, which I was surprised with. And I've always been saying to the, you don't need to change your personality. Actually, you need to be yourself. You need to be authentic. And that will be the best leader if you're authentic.
Anna, I saw your hand. Would you like to add? Yeah.
I think that one of the more important problems in women is care of children and care of elder people. That takes almost 2 to 3 hours per day. And this make you do not have time to, as the next question is, to participate in committees, to go to a conference, to have time to read or to prepare your work. And this is very hard for women. We have done a survey some time ago about the superior researchers in Argentina. And we asked if they were married or not. And most of the men were married and most of the women were single, because especially the old generation have sacrificed their personal life to have a career. And this is very hard for a person, not women, men, or diversity. So I think care is in the heart of the programs. And then, of course, if you go less to conference, you are less seated, less known by other people, and everything is complicated. And we have to add also the gender violences in different workplaces, and this exists. This is another reason that for women it's very difficult to progress, and for women it's very difficult to continue in their careers.
Great, and I want to highlight just one comment that was actually in the Q&A. I think a really insightful comment about balancing the need for leadership and in order to kind of increase the quality of the environment for women. But there's also a really, I think, an insightful comment about the need for addressing issues of affordable daycare and after-school care. And I think we'd add elder care as well. So I think those comments really synergize nicely. And before we go on to the next topic, I think you have,
well, actually, I was just going to make that comment, actually, because I saw that Eva Nogles made that about the daycare. And actually, I think that's really important. I mean, that is actually, I didn't mention that from EMBL's point of view because it's not new, but, you know, at EMBL Heidelberg, for example, we have an excellent daycare. And this is absolutely essential for all of the parents, but especially for the women, as you say. It's a daycare that will also take babies. It's right on site. You can go there during the day. It's open, you know, till 6 p.m., etc. And that's absolutely essential. And also for the female PIs, group leaders. So I totally agree. And it goes back to what you were saying, Anna. Like if you don't take care of that, yeah, it's a very challenging situation. I mean, the only one other thing that I would say is, you know, when people ask me about, you know, about this issue of, and also how do you balance, you know, family and research, etc. I think one thing we do have a choice in as women is who your partner is. And I always tell women that, like, this is, I'm not, you know, it sounds like a joke, but, you know, to discuss this, if you're serious about science, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's a brilliant job, but, you know, your partner needs to do 100% sometimes, you know, not just 50%. Exactly like what you said, Anna, you're going to be on a conference sometime, so etc. So you need to have those conversations. That's just my advice.
Wonderful advice. I really appreciate that. And I think really thoughtful responses. I think before we leave this, and I think this may be a relatively straightforward answer, I do want to acknowledge that one of the other questions was, where do women, if they're leaving the science profession, where do they go? Do you know from your work, Alex? This is a question from Lucifer.
Yeah, that's another really fantastic question. So I think that there's a few different ways to answer that. I saw the question in the Q&A. One is that there is movement within disciplines within science, right? That the cultures of different disciplines vary based on how receptive the environment is and the evolving interests of individuals. And we do see migration patterns of individuals throughout topics of science, and those tend to be gendered. So there is differential flows in certain directions. There's still some question as to, you know, which is it, the fundamental theory? Is it the idea of a culture? What's the driving factor behind that? But you definitely see flows amongst topics. Stepping outside of that, though, there's a larger propensity for women to, at least in current environments to attain leadership roles, right? There are fewer of them, and you need to have women in more prominent positions in order to change cultures more drastically throughout the university. And so there's a tendency for women to be adopting more leadership capacity at the university. We can't do everything, and so women tend to then publish less, which is what that result in particular is showing. So attaining more prominent leadership positions at the university tends to decrease the amount of research that women are producing, even though, you know, I would still say they're really contributing more to the scientific enterprise than they otherwise would. And then finally, there's the question of what happens when they stop completely. What happens when they leave? And there are varying accounts to this, but I think there it's like the stories that everyone has been sharing, that typically the situation at home becomes more dominant, and people decide that the career within academia is not as flexible and too demanding for the stresses that they have at home, and so they leave to find more flexible positions.
Thank you all for those responses. I think just one of the things I can summarize is it seems like there really needs to be a deep dive into structures and processes in the institutions that foster environments where everyone, particularly in this conversation, women can thrive. So thank you for sharing your expertise. Another question maybe I'd like to put to the group. And there's fantastic things going on. What do you do when you meet resistance? And how do you bring people in the conversation who may be new at caring about diversity or maybe even resistant to change? And again, I'll open it out. Maybe Anna and Eileen, you can take a stab at this one first.
Well, I mean, that's a really difficult question. I mean, it's absolutely pertinent, Tracy, but that's difficult. You know, and this is actually a challenge, I think, and this is exactly what we want to do, especially, I think, you know, and I'm putting myself in this bracket as one of the oldies. I mean, at EMBL, I am one of the oldies. I am getting old anyway. But you know, it's my it's the generation of me and above that is maybe slightly more of an issue. Let's say. I think the younger generation is getting this training, still needs this training. But yes, how do we? So this is something that we're just now discussing and thinking about at EMBL to train the leadership as well, and to discuss with the leadership and to get them more involved. But you're absolutely right. How do you, yes, typically, you know, and it's probably the same with this seminar. The participants that are at this seminar that are listening now are probably the ones that are already thinking about EDI, are very engaged, are very interested in this. So how do we bring the people that are not? In some cases, this has been a little bit helped, I think, by policies now. So there's policies, for example, where when you need to apply for a grant, for example, now with the ERC, which is the European Research Council, these are the biggest grants you can probably get in Europe. They're also very prestigious. So it's not as much money as HHMI, but it would kind of be the equivalent. So when you do that, your institute needs to have an EDI policy. And it has to show it as an EDI policy and EDI strategy. So this is one way, for example, we could say to upper leadership, we need to invest in an EDI team, we need to invest in EDI for this. Also for other, you know, funding agencies, I think the MRC might be doing the same, and there's lots of, in Spain, there's lots of national funding agencies that are doing the same. So that is one way. But how do you then get people thinking about this within their groups and within their departments? I think it's a lot of open discussion and exchange. But yeah, it's a tough question, Tracy.
I think that it's very important that women or people must be conscious that this is not a personal problem. It's a problem of the system that not encourage women to try to be to participate or to reach leader position. I think that is a feminist concept that personal is political. So when we talk with women, when we do seminars or different ways to communicate with them, and we say, no, it's not your problem. It's not that you can do that. It's a problem of the system that don't help you to have the same opportunities than men. I think that people became to join with others and began to discuss the problem. And in the discussion, some solutions are beginning to appear. So for me, the idea, as it's happening in other spaces like education, political, etc., is to make people know it's not that you can't, it's that we can't, because we have a lot of problems to reach the same position than men.
Thank you so much. You know, this is something that I think really resonated when Eileen was speaking. You know, we're all scientists, we measure things for a living, we tweak our experiments until we have results that are measurable. And so applying the same principle, what does progress look like? How do we know when we've been successful in achieving EDI?
I guess that goes back to the data generation, though. I mean, collecting your data is a continuous process, because exactly like you said, if you don't keep doing surveys and collecting data, how do you know exactly, like you said, you've increased, that's for your diversity, and then for your inclusion as well, and how many different diverse people with diverse characteristics are, you know, reaching different levels within your organization. But I would guess, Alex, you will have numbers for this, or have even better ideas for this.
Yeah, I think though, so I think, of course, data generation and gathering is essential to understanding these types of systems. But much more fundamentally, I would even question if we could ever be done. I think that the idea that there is a final point that in which, you know, equality can be reached across the board is a little bit too much of a utopia. That I think, practically speaking, we are always going to be in the situation where somebody is disadvantaged within the system. And we are going to need to be cognizant of that and always working towards the ideal of equity across the board, but recognizing that it's really very much an ideal in human society, and that it's always going to be a constant process of reaching towards that.
Thank you so much for that. I think that that's such an important point, that this is a process, and it's not necessarily possible to reach a particular destination, but we're constantly going to be on this path. And I think, Anna, the way you introduced your presentation with data that on the surface looks like progress, and then digging a little bit more deeply into what the numbers mean, I think really illustrates Eileen's point beautifully, that we have to constantly be collecting the data and doing so critically. So I think we're going to, this has been a really wonderful chance for us to speak to each other, and we're going to open our discussion up for the panelists to answer some of the questions that are coming in from the Q&A. And I think one of them that I will start with is a question. There's some really wonderful feedback that people are appreciating the work that you're all doing, and I share that sentiment. One of the questions that comes up in the Q&A is whether you think quotas may be a useful tool for addressing gender inequality. And granted, there are a lot of people in our audience who may be in institutions in parts of the world where quotas are handled differently. But I think it's really useful to unpack this question. Are quotas a useful tool? And I'll present that to the entire panel. Well, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot a little bit, Eileen, I think there was, I think something in your presentation mentioned that as opposed to setting specific quotas, that there were objectives that were achieved without the quotas. And so maybe even starting there in the role that quotas do or don't play in getting those results.
Yeah, so I mean, we've actually had multiple discussions about it with the leadership, and we decided to first try a concerted effort. So we all thankfully agreed, all of the heads of departments, and then we said, okay, we'll really try now without having a strict quota, but to see how we go with just having these active discussions with everybody being much more conscious about this, to see if we could increase the number of female faculty hires without having quotas. We did increase our quota for the number of female applicants that need to be interviewed. I think that was the only quota, but we actually did a lot of statistics. The reason why we came to this decision on the quotas and not to apply a strict quota is because we surveyed our statistics from HR of what percentage of females apply. These are people who identify as female, apply for faculty positions. What percentage of females do we select for interview, and what percentage do we hire? And we did that over, I think it was a 15 or so year period. And EMBL has, because we have a turnover system of 9 years, we recruit about 8 to 10 faculty members a year. So this is like, it's quite a large number of people, a lot of searches. So faculty, like independent faculty searches a year. So it was quite a large pool. And so typically we had at that time, in that cohort, let's say 10 or 15 years, we had about, on average, like it was 25% females were applying. We had somewhere between 26, 28%, no, the other way around. Let's say if it was 28% applied, 25% were being selected for interview and 25% were hired. So we might have had a tiny drop off, but we felt like we didn't have a major bias issue. The issue, you know, I'm sure we all have biases, but it wasn't like we had 50% females and we're only interviewing 25%. Our problem was that we weren't getting the females applying in the first place. So we tried to address that specifically and very actively, going after females, inviting postdocs to come and visit the EMBL, and also talking to postdocs at meetings and things like that. And that has actually worked for us. It's very active, it takes a lot of effort, but that has been working so far.
I think that the idea of quotes in science is very hard to put in action, but maybe in the positions of political decisors or directors of institutes or person who participates in committees could be a quote. For example, we have 60% of university students, 60% of 60% of women university students, 60% of women professors, but only 11% of presidents of universities. And now we have a quote political in the committees of most of the universities, where 50% must be women. The persons in the committees are elected by students, teachers, etc. So the list have to have 50% of women in the list. I think in these places, quotes could be a useful tool to improve the participation of women. We have, as I said, we have a lot of women in science. So a quote in scholarship, I don't know if it would be necessary. Only in very special disciplines we have less women, like engineering or informatics. But in the others, I think it would be very hard to put quotes in science.
So I would add too that I'm a big fan of quotas. I think the quotas are really good because they're a mechanism that makes the population composition very cognizant to the individuals making the decisions. But I'm wary of quotas in the sense that many people just rely on them as the only mechanism for intervening and the only policy for intervening in the system. And I think over and over again, we've seen that quotas alone are not enough. Just getting people into the system is not enough. You need to support them and give them the tools they need to succeed while they're there. And I think that the danger of a quota is that it's something that people can point to that they've done something without actually having intervened across the whole lifetime of the individual within the system. So I'm a huge fan of quotas in combination with lots of other policies to support and promote individuals throughout their entire lifetime. And hopefully that's to extend that lifetime within science.
Thank you for those answers. Really rich ideas to ponder. Alex, I think I'm going to pick up on something that you described in your talk, and there've been a couple of questions that are related about the citation data, and so maybe there'll be a two-part question. The first is whether you see there's a difference. I'm sorry, how much men versus women? How much men versus women are likely to cite themselves? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, I think many of us found it really eye-opening, your data about the citation disparity. And there was a question about whether that might be because women might be publishing less, and then that is why there are fewer citations. So if you want to take those in either order, that'd be great.
Yeah, both are fantastic questions. So I'll address the self-citation part first. I think that there's the stigma in science that self-citation is bad, and that's because there have been a few actors that have really abused the idea of what a citation is and the metric of a citation as a way of measuring scientific success, and have done a lot of devious behaviors to inflate their own citations. But if you step back and think about it, self-citation is really a healthy behavior. You're expected as an individual to have concentrated research effort in a particular direction with a focus, and funders really look for this, right? You don't want your papers all to be disparate and disconnected from each other. So self-citation is a very natural behavior in science. And when you look at the data of who is more likely to self-cite and how that all breaks down, what you see is actually that young researchers are the most likely to be self-citing. And that's typically because they're the ones who know about their work the best, and they need to show and demonstrate that they have a concerted research effort in a particular direction. So I think it's a very healthy behavior in that sense. Once you disentangle the few bad actors who are abusing the system and creating those review articles with 200 self-citations, that are completely irrelevant and disconnected from each other. So I haven't seen any work that has actually looked at what's the prevalence of self-citation, especially broken down by gender, race, and ethnicity. Once you've removed devious behavior, if that there's really a fundamental difference in how individuals are promoting and building up their research agendas. But we know that the ones who do the devious behavior are more likely to be men. And so there's these feedback loops that kind of fit in with that. I think it's a really wonderful question, and definitely some more work needs to be done in that direction. So the second question, though, sorry, can you remind me exactly what the phrasing?
Yeah, the second question was whether the citation data underlying that might be that women scientists are publishing less.
Yeah, so again, it's really difficult to disentangle causes from consequences in all of these types of things. Some of our matching experiments in which we controlled for many of the confounding factors suggests that when you focus on individual careers, the biggest difference in citations is predominantly the length of the career, or actually the volume of work that's being produced throughout the career, right? There's many work over and over again that suggests that the more you produce, the more likely you're to get hit papers which dominate citations. All these things are heavy-tailed, so you really can't. There's a lot of complicated mathematics under the hood of there, trying to disentangle what is really just the natural behavior of science and what is a bias or a gender-based difference that's really at play here. But the work that looks at how people are referencing individuals also suggests that while the papers are out there at the volume that you would expect them to be out there on the topics that you would expect them to be on, they're still getting differential attention, right? So it has not as much to do with the individuals and about individual careers at that point. It's talking about the decisions that people are making in terms of which work they're discussing and promoting. And next, everybody always says, well, I never take gender into account when I'm looking at my reference list. I'm always looking at lots of other things and considering, but I think that implicitly gender creeps in to these types of reference lists, right? We know that there's differences in how individuals promote their work. And so you might just be more readily read on certain work because those men were the ones talking about it in louder voices at the conferences and more dominating of the conversation, whereas there is probably better work out there by women authors which just wasn't on your radar nearly as much. And so you should take the cognitive effort to search the literature a little bit more deeply, to be a little bit more well-read, and to be cognizant that there are all these implicit biases on kind of impacting which work you're selecting when you're creating your own reference list.
Alex, I really appreciate that. I think again, another theme is being really intentional about how we approach our EDI work. So thank you for that answer. I know we're running close to time, but there are a couple of really fabulous questions I want to make sure we get to. One of them is about expectations. The question is whether or not a difference in the expected work of men and women is underlying some of the disparities. So the questioner says that while women are expected to participate in a lot of voluntary activity at a university, that same expectation may not be there for men. And so how do those expectations, particularly around service work, potentially influence the careers of women and men?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think one of the issues typically, which probably all women and everybody with, intersectional diversity as well will face is you're always asked then, to have a diverse panel. So the same people get asked again and again, which you can think is volunteer service work, etc., as being a good faculty member. And of course, we're not the best at saying no either. So what that means, though, in effect, though, is then compared to your male colleague, it's more time away from your research, away from your lab in essence. So how do you weigh that up? Because in the end, if you're judged based on, depending on what your tenure track process is, if you're being judged on your publication rate, on the number of grants you're pulling in, all of those committees are time taken away from that, even those committees are very important. So it is an issue until like the number, let's say, of diversity numbers increase to spread out the load. Yeah, it's something that I don't have a solution for, to be honest with you. And I'd be curious to hear, what the rest of the panel, and also for you, Tracy, what's your experience in the US and other countries?
I think your point is really well taken. It's a real challenge. One of the reasons why we like having diverse colleagues is because people are interested in different things. And so certain service activities become really quite attractive. I would say there are briefly two things. One is that we reward what we say we value. And so we help start thinking about our reward system to ensure that it's consistent with what we say is important. And if certain service is important, that should be rewarded, included by protected time. And I think the second is that good mentorship really comes into it. How do we support colleagues in the efforts to say no, sometimes to people who are very difficult to say no to? But I think it is an ongoing challenge. You know, I want to end with a question that came up. And I apologize for anyone whose questions I didn't get to. There's some really, really great discussions in the Q&A. And hopefully you'll stay after in some of the conversations with trainees. I think one of the questions that I'd like to end with is what the role of outside bodies, granting agencies, boards, societies, what is the role of those outside groups in as a mechanism for driving change? And that's a nod to our hosts who are helping us engage in this conversation.
Maybe the financial agencies that give less money to women, and this is another reality, could have some surveys, some grants, especially for women and dissidents, or maybe especially for young women to improve in their career. This could be a positive measure to improve the careers of women, and also the presence of women in their committees, no? That would be important also.
Terrific. I think that's a really great way for us to wrap up our discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists for sharing the work that you're doing locally, as well as really at a national and in some cases international level. And thank you for the research that you shared that can really help guide our actions in our own local contexts. And so with that, I would also like to thank our hosts, and that'll conclude our Q&A. And thank you all for joining us today.